Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
All right, I forgot to tell you this, but beginning Monday, this Monday, we will be back on radio. Just terrestrial radio, which means you cannot curse anymore. Please, no cussing here. We have to stay within the regs now, the FCC regulations. So no more cursing. I do have a dump button now. And we're ready to launch it. So we'll start in San Francisco, of all places, the scene of the crime. For those of you who are longtime listeners, you know what I'm talking about. But yes, we're going to return back to the radio, Real Talk 910. And they will air the show during drive time. So we'll follow Rick Unger on Real Talk 910 in San Francisco, starting Monday from 5 o'clock in the afternoon there to 7 p.m., which is great. I mean, I'm very excited. Thank you very much to Real Talk 910 for reinstating after all these years. I feel like I just got out of jail or something. People are going to go, oh, where have you been? I'll just say I was in jail. So that'll be the job. I've been in jail is what it is. All right, so what does a 75-year-old man who died in North Carolina have to do with the contempt vote that was taken today by the House Oversight Committee, which actually happened? Okay, the vote was 24 to hold Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, and Bill Barr, the Attorney General, in contempt of Congress. It's just the committee vote, not the full House vote. It's a start. This could take years. It's a civil contempt vote. It is so that they can go to the court and ask the court to pressure them to release documents because they're in contempt of Congress. And then perhaps the civil court will fine them. We don't know. It's never been done. I keep telling you, there is no precedent for fining somebody for violating a congressional subpoena. We do have precedent for locking people up, but that's criminal contempt. And there's also inherent contempt, which I'm all about. Inherent contempt means Congress can conduct its own freaking trial. It can call witnesses. It could have a trial. It could, question witnesses, cross-examine witnesses. Obviously, the Republicans would do that. And at the end of this trial, there could be a verdict. And if the verdict is guilty of contempt or guilty of defying congressional subpoena, the House Sergeant-at-Arms could go then and lock that person up. I'm all about that. You don't need the Senate for any of this. You don't need the court for any of this. I think the thinking on the House side is they want to bring in the third branch of government. They want to bring the courts in so that it's not just, Congress versus the executive, right? They want to reach out to the neutral third party, which they think is the courts, and they want the courts to adjudicate one way or the other so that they have the strength of a second branch. That's what I believe they're thinking. But going to court could take years, as we all know, because, they use the example of Eric Holder. That was 7 years. So this is where we are, except to say the Supreme Court heard, and the reason why they held him in contempt is because they want these documents. They want this 75-year-old man's documents, which his daughter, by accident, found when she was going through her deceased father's personal effects. All right. Stephanie Hofeller, the daughter of Tom Hofeller, the Michelangelo of gerrymandering, lived in North Carolina. He has mythic status among the Republicans for being able to he's a cartographer. He's a map guy. He draws maps. And he's got this mythic status among Republicans for drawing maps that give the Republicans the House and the Senate, not the Senate, but the House over and over, and the state legislatures over and over and over again by drawing these ridiculous districts. Okay? Now he dies. And until he died, he was like a bystander in the citizenship question debate. He was mentioned only once in the thousands of pages that were presented to the Supreme Court on the question of whether or not the citizenship question should be included. Well, it turns out that on Mr. Hofeller's possession, when his daughter went through his possessions and sorted through his personal effects, looking for things that she had asked her father to save for her, she came across this clear plastic bag. This is like a movie. And in this clear plastic bag were 4 external hard drives and 18 thumb drives. And what those were the backups of the data on his laptop. Her mother allowed Stephanie Hofeller, Mr. Thomas Hofeller's daughter, to take them. And she turned them over to Common Cause. First, she went to the Raleigh office of Common Cause, and she wanted them to help her find a lawyer unconnected to her father to help settle his estate. And then after they spoke a few times, she mentioned the hard drives in passing. And she said that she believed her father was an expert on gerrymandering. Well, this was North Carolina, and Common Cause had filed the lawsuit in state court challenging the gerrymandered maps of North Carolina. And it turns out that those gerrymandered maps, which the Supreme Court said were illegal because they were designed based on race to dilute Democratic voters or people who seem to be Democratic voters based on their race, the Supreme Court struck those maps. And it turned out that it was Common Cause that had brought that lawsuit in the first place, and that her father was the person who drew those illegal maps. So now the citizenship question comes up. And Wilbur Ross testifies to Congress that, he's just doing it to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Well, it turns out that Mr. Hofeller was asked to have a look at a new gerrymander with regard to the new maps that were ordered drawn. And he figured out that he could dilute the power of legislative districts that would favor non-Hispanic whites and Republicans if you put a citizenship question on the census. He ran all the numbers. He did all. He assessed the impact of drawing political maps that were not based on a state's total population, but which is the practice everywhere in our nation. Legislative maps are supposed to be based on the state's total population, total. Not on race, not on status, not on age, not on anything, because the money that gets apportioned, as well as the districts that get drawn, depends on children, who need money for schools. Depends on everyone who lives there, because people will go to the hospital, whether they're citizens or not. You follow? Well, he decided that if we got away from the state's total population as the method to draw the maps, and instead focused on citizens of voting age only, and put the citizenship question on the census, he could favor Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. That's what's on these thumb drives. That's what's on these backups. And the Supreme Court never heard a word about it because she just found it in May.
This is the Randi Rhodes Show. To speak with Randi, dial 561-270-3844. That's 561-270-3844.
Suppose we have a very tiny state of 50 people. 30 of them belong to the blue party and 20 belong to the red party. And just our luck, they all live in a nice even grid with blues on one side of the state and reds on the other. Now, let's say we need to divide the state into 5 districts. Each district will send one representative to the House to represent the people. Fortunately, because our citizens live in a neatly ordered grid, it's easy to draw 5 lengthy districts, 2 for the reds and 3 for the blues. Voila! perfectly proportional representation, just as the founders intended. Now, let's say instead that the blue party controls the state government, and they get to decide how the lines are drawn. Rather than draw districts horizontally, they draw them vertically, so that in each district there are 6 blues and 4 reds. With a comfortable blue majority in the state, each district elects a blue candidate to the House. The blues win 5 seats, and the reds don't get a single one. Oh well, finally, what if the red party controls the state government? The reds know they're at a numerical disadvantage, but with some creative boundary drawing, they can slice the blue population up such that they only get a majority in 2 districts. So despite making up 40% of the population, the reds win 60% of the seats. Not bad. This process of redrawing district lines to give an advantage to one party over another is called gerrymandering, and it's nothing new. The term gerrymander is named after early 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who redrew the map of the Senate's districts in 1810 in order to weaken the opposing Federalist Party. Our example is, of course, a huge simplification. In the real world, people don't live in neatly ordered grids sorted by political party. But for politicians looking to give themselves an advantage at redistricting time, the process is exactly the same, and the consequences are very real. Gerrymandering is at least partly to blame for lopsided representation in the House seen in recent elections. And, it's been argued by the president, for political polarization, since representatives don't have to compromise hardline views in order to win seats.
And there you have the reason for and an illustration of gerrymandering. So when you sit around and you look at it and you go, oh, I live in a very Democratic district, but, we keep electing a Republican. Perhaps this is your issue. And so that is why the Supreme Court needs to rehear the case of adding the citizenship question to the census. Because a 75-year-old man, after drawing what the Supreme Court determined were illegal districts, they were not based on the state's population, which is how we're supposed to be drawing maps. This man decided that he would do it based on race. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court struck down North Carolina's gerrymandered maps of North Carolina's legislative districts that were drawn by Tom Hofeller. Tom Hofeller dies. His daughter is allowed finally to go through his personal effects. She finds a plastic bag. In that plastic bag, she finds those gerrymandered maps. She also finds a new plan, a plan that will redistrict North Carolina, because they were charged with drawing new districts by the Supreme Court, but this time based only on voting-aged white people. And the problem he had, the fatal flaw he had in his maps, were that there was no place to go to get information regarding voting-aged white people who were, citizens. And so he concocted the idea, we'll put a citizenship question on the census, and that's where we'll get the information from. The Supreme Court heard the redistricting plan. They heard from both sides of this issue, April 23rd. Problem? Stephanie Hofeller didn't find her father's thumb drives and hard drives until May. So the Supreme Court is getting ready to rule on the citizenship question, which was dreamt up by her father as another way to gerrymander. And he's been doing it his whole life. He is the Michelangelo of gerrymandering, thinking of weird ways to keep the Republicans in the majority in the House of Representatives, despite population changes, and state legislatures, despite population changes. And the Supreme Court has not seen this evidence, and they're going to rule at the end of this month. And by all accounts, when they were hearing the bogus, the lying testimony from the administration about why they wanted to put a citizenship question on the census, and of course, leaving out all of this data, leaving out all of this information, leaving out this detailed letter that this man Hofeller sent to the Census Bureau, in December of 2017, presenting these nuanced and technical arguments that citizenship data could give them the information they needed to gerrymander the maps for a Republican majority for at least another, 50 years, the Supreme Court seemed inclined to accept the administration's argument. And now we know that there's evidence that counters what they argued and what Wilbur Ross testified to Congress under oath. That's why there was a contempt vote today. Now, Wilbur Ross is going to tell you that he turned over 14,000 documents and he testified. But the truth here is that the documents that Wilbur Ross turned over were public documents, things we'd already seen, had nothing to do with Tom Hofeller's secret plan to gerrymander based nationwide, based on collecting data of citizens of voting age. There was no source for that information. So he decided, well, if we put a citizenship question on the census, then we'll have a place to go get the data, and then we could gerrymander around that. Leave out the kids, leave out the non-citizens. Maybe they're here with a green card. Maybe they're here legally, but they're not a citizen yet. Maybe they're, on a work visa, but they're not citizens yet. Well, I'll tell you what, when the money gets apportioned, they're going to get sick too. They need hospitals to account for the population, the size of the population, not just citizens. It's just a fact. And that's why they voted today, the Oversight Committee did, to get these documents, to get these. That's what's going on. And I haven't heard anybody give you a decent explanation. Here's Wilbur Ross saying, we turned over before. This guy is so... He is like... he's better than Ambien, this guy. This guy is like Lunesta on Ambien.
There's a contempt vote now tomorrow, apparently, on the census issue.
Why do they all look like that?
Elijah Cummings has scheduled a committee vote for Wednesday. The Trump administration is basically not honoring any subpoenas. Is this just getting caught up in that, Wilbur? Why are you not?
Well, wait a minute. Let's not say we're not honoring this and that. What we are respecting is long-standing practice. We're not accepting the unredaction of documents that 3 lower courts, 2 appellate courts, and the Supreme Court have gone along with. Let's make sure we define exactly what's going on. We have produced to the House Oversight Committee 14,000 pages of material. I testified before them for almost 7 hours. We're producing 3 more witnesses, the only 3 that they've requested, including 1 today. So please don't tell me we're not cooperating.
Okay.
What we are doing is cooperating in a rational way that's consistent with the rules, the regulations, the laws, and prior practice.
So the 14,000 pages, again, in the Washington Post, there's an article today. If you go to randyrhodes.com and click on the homework, you'll get the homework. It's free. But the 14,000 pages of documents that were submitted were already publicly available. And in spite of them being publicly available, they were heavily redacted and they were not responsive documents to the committee's request for these thumb drives and these hard drives. The Supreme Court when they argued the case in April, the Supreme Court had no idea that these even existed because nobody did except for the deceased Mr. Tom Hofeller. His daughter didn't know that those things existed until May. And they're going to decide this case at the end of June. Can you see that the fix is always in with them? And when you have a party, any party, that needs to cheat in order to stay in power or get power, trust me, they're not representing your best interest. Because if they were, you wouldn't have to be gerrymandered out of the equation. They wouldn't have to go searching for ways to stay the majority. Their policies alone would be so magnificent and so important to you and so meaningful to you that nobody would even think of rigging the vote. This is not the case here. What you have is Wilbur Ross lying to Congress about the existence of these documents, and a man named Mr. Gore who refused to answer 150 questions that Congress asked of him. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.